everyone, and welcome to the Down Syndrome Center podcast. As always, I'm your host, Dr. Kishore Volodi, and today we have a returning guest today. A friend of the podcast is what we call a returning guest, and that is Dr. Ruth Brown, who's joining us today. Dr. Brown, Ruth, why don't you go ahead and share with our listeners who may not remember you from our prior podcast together, who you are, what you do, and what draws you to working with our population?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah,
First, just thanks for having me on the podcast again. It's
yeah,
real honored to be here. So I am a clinical psychologist and also an assistant professor at Virginia Commonwealth University. And I have been kind of doing research on mental health and Down syndrome for over 10 years now,
yeah.
I guess.
Wow.
So I got interested in this population actually towards the end of my clinical training because we didn't really receive any training on, serving people with intellectual developmental disabilities. And it wasn't until I went away on internship that I really, kind of fell in love with, this population. I went to a kind of a more long-term residential care facility for adolescents and adults with intellectual disabilities and really fell in love with it
Yeah,
and wanted to focus my career on that.
that's awesome.
And so yeah, so this project is actually like this was like the kind of seed, the very kind of first project, that I did, and I can go into the history of that more
Yeah.
now or
Well, yeah, I mean, we will definitely, I mean, because there was definitely a really interesting article, and this is why I actually asked you to join us on the podcast today to share with our listeners. As most of our listeners probably know, there are three main types of Down syndrome, ways of having Down syndrome. The most common one is the one we know probably the most about, which is where every cell in the body will have one extra chromosome 21. But then there are ones that are a little bit rarer, like translocation type, which maybe 3 to 4% of the time, where people will have this type of Down syndrome. This is the type that is more likely to occur in future pregnancies. So we know a little bit about translocation type too, but the one we're going to talk about today is mosaic type Down syndrome, which is the rarest. Around, I think, 1% or less of people with Down syndrome will have mosaic type Down syndrome. And those we don't really know much as much as we should about mosaic type Down syndrome. In fact, when I talk to folks who have mosaic type Down syndrome or family members, they often comment on that fact that there's really little focus on mosaic type Down syndrome. And so, well, that's not the case in your study, which I think is going to be really exciting to talk about. And we've definitely had just talks about depression, anxiety, things like that, and Down syndrome in general, but we've never really looked at it in terms of mosaic type, and I think it's really exciting. So yes, I would love for you to share with us a little bit about the background of this study that you did and how it might help our listeners as well.
yeah. Yeah, the kind of history of the study is really it grew out of a kind of a parent and self-advocate identified need, like you said, that people were saying like there's not enough information out here. And so when I finished graduate school and I wanted to, to kind of figure out how to get involved and get started, um, I had the pleasure of being introduced to Dr. Colleen Jackson Cook, who is here at VCU,
Okay.
and Dr. Jackson Cook has been involved with the International Mosaic Down Syndrome Association. I think basically since the beginning. I think she kind of helped to kind of organize the parents into that group. And the parents in the IMDSA had been recognizing, as their loved ones kind of entered into adolescence and adulthood, growing kind of mental health concerns, and the lack of data out there. And so it was just really kind of kismet that we ended up, being connected because I
Yeah.
wanted to do the research and they were looking for somebody to do the research. And so I went and I attended one of their research retreat weekends where they invite researchers to come out to an event. They kind of travel around the country and have them once every 1 or 2 years. And so it's a nice opportunity for families to get together and
Hmm.
self-advocates and meet other people who have mosaic Down syndrome because,
Uh-huh.
as you said, it's usually they're the only person in their community
Yeah.
that have that. And so it's really nice opportunity for them to kind of be in community with each other. And then also for researchers to come and share what they know and to collect data. And so we started with a small pilot project and, collected some data, self-report data, parent-report
Uh-huh.
data on anxiety and depression symptoms. I did that for a few years. And then just the interactions too were really helpful in kind of learning about the families and learning about the challenges and the
Yeah.
strengths and and everything. And so we were eventually able to get NIH funding to then
Wow.
do a larger scale project.
Yeah.
Um, and with that one said that this is the kind of the first paper from that study. And so really
That's
excited to
great.
see it finally kind of coming full circle.
And before we get to the specifics of this study, I just wanted to get your take on, we've done podcasts in the past on depression and anxiety and Down syndrome with Dr. Anna Espenson. We did a couple of years ago. But I guess what a lot of people may not recognize is that depression and anxiety do happen in people with Down syndrome. The fallacy that everybody with Down syndrome is always happy is kind of one of those frustrating things for those of us who have family members with Down syndrome who have the gamut of emotions like everybody else. And so, what do we know about depression and anxiety and Down syndrome in general? And then, what did your study start to tell us about mosaic type in specifically?
Yeah, I think it still is relatively understudied,
Mm-hmm.
even among people with Down syndrome.
Mm-hmm.
That and there, and so we seek, depending on kind of who they're asking, where the samples are coming from. Is it a community sample? Is it a specialty clinic sample? What sorts of tools they're using to measure symptoms? Are they using medical records? Are they asking parents? Are they asking the person themselves? We see really a wide range of of data, and so we see conflicting results as far as like,
Mm-hmm.
is it more or less common than people who have kind of similar developmental disabilities? Is it more or less common than the general population? Some studies say it's more prevalent, that both anxiety and depression are more prevalent compared to the general population or to people with other developmental disabilities. Other studies say less, but
Okay.
there's a lot of variability
Mm-hmm.
in the methods that the studies use.
Yeah.
So we definitely need more research in that area.
Yes. And
Yeah.
so glad to have people like you who are interested in this type of research. So tell us about what you found out specifically about mosaic Down syndrome then.
Okay.
And depression, anxiety in this population.
Yes. So what we did, we looked at, well, first of all, I should say like anxiety and depression symptoms. So we did
Yes.
look at
Okay.
diagnostic level data.
Okay.
We did, in this, this kind of follow-up study, we did collect that, and we're working on kind of crunching those numbers. So that'll be one of the next things to come out.
Yeah.
But this is just on kind of symptoms and self-reported symptoms. In particular is what I really wanted to highlight, because I think that's something that we don't use enough of. Um, but we do see pretty high rates of depression
Hmm.
and especially anxiety. So about half of the sample reported symptoms, elevated symptoms of depression
Wow.
on these rating scales. And the rating scales are similar. They're not the same ones that you might answer at the doctor's office, but kind of similar when you kind of go in and get routine screening and asking
Hmm.
about sadness and these tools have a kind of a recommended cutoff. And so if you score above a score, then that says, hey, you should pay attention to this, or your doctor should, like you should get some additional um, evaluations to figure out, what's going on, if there's a medical cause or whatever. So it isn't saying that half of the sample had major depressive disorder,
Right. Okay.
but that they had elevated depression symptoms,
Hmm.
and that is a concern,
Yes, of course.
and then about 3/4 of the sample had elevated anxiety
Wow.
symptoms. So very, very high levels of
Yeah.
anxiety. And so, um, yeah, so
But
I think those are the big
those
findings.
are
Like, yeah,
those are yeah, those are really, sobering kind of data to think about this entire population of people having that high of an incidence in these types of symptoms. I forget if the paper or if the study or any prior studies have talked about like does this seem to be higher than what we would see in someone with Down syndrome who doesn't have mosaic Down syndrome?
so that's the data that we're working
Yeah.
on now. So that with
Okay.
this, once we got the NIH funding, we got funding to look, to kind of do a specific focus on mosaic Down syndrome, but then also collect data, a kind of a comparison sample of people with, with kind of full trisomy 21 with regular Down
Yeah.
syndrome. And so we are kind of looking at that now. So I don't have that
Okay.
direct comparison yet.
Yeah. Yeah, but it's coming. That's exciting to know
But
it's
it's going to
coming.
be,
Yeah.
yeah, it's going to be coming. So then that way we see with the same methods, what do we see?
Yeah.
And so sometimes it's hard to compare. Um, I think just anecdotally, if I were to kind of maybe reach beyond the data a little bit and kind of just,
Yeah.
kind of speak from, from either what I've read or, from some of the experiences, of families and what they've talked about are kind of challenges of fitting
Mm-hmm.
in a way that I think may be kind of unique to
Yeah.
people with mosaic Down syndrome.
Mm-hmm.
That many of the self advocates themselves, or their parents kind of describe challenges around not fully fitting in with peers with Down syndrome,
Yeah.
because they, maybe aren't impacted quite as much, like their,
Mm-hmm.
developmental delays are not quite as pronounced, or,
Mm-hmm.
but then at the same time, they don't fully fit in with
Yeah.
their kind of neurotypical peers.
Yeah.
And so then they experience like, some kind of isolation in some ways. Bullying and things were really, those bullying experiences were discussed a lot. And I think were really
Mm.
relevant to a lot of people where they just don't feel like they fully fit in. And so I think that's probably a component to it. Um, I think what we saw, so one of the things that we did look at was the relationship between the percentage of trisomic
Yeah.
cells,
Mm-hmm.
and those symptoms, and that would give us maybe potentially a little bit of a hint of that,
Yeah.
like is it something about the 21st chromosome in particular that's driving that? So within our sample, we have, some individuals who may only have like, a few percentage of trisomic
Mm-hmm.
cells, and so they may have like 5%, for example.
Mm-hmm.
And often people who have these kind of lower percentages of trisomic cells, may appear more neurotypical. They may be kind
Mm-hmm.
of impacted a little bit less. Um,
Mm-hmm.
Whereas then the greater number of trisomic cells, the more they, more similar to a person with regular
Mm-hmm.
trisomy 21. So it creates a
Yeah.
kind of a Down syndrome spectrum, which is really interesting. And so we wanted to see, did that seem to be associated with their depression or anxiety symptoms? We didn't see any association with depression symptoms. So the more
Mm-hmm.
trisomic cells they had or the less, it didn't seem to be associated. We saw a little bit of a signal. It's a relatively small sample, but a little bit of a signal with kind of fearfulness,
Mm-hmm.
and kind of having what we call specific phobias, related symptoms, being afraid of the dark, being afraid of
Mm-hmm.
spiders and animals and things like that, with their trisomic cells, so that the more trisomic cells they had, the more fearful they were.
Mm-hmm.
But it was really small. And then once we kind of corrected for multiple testing, where we have to just make sure that we're not fishing,
Yeah.
basically, um, that was no longer significant. So I
Okay.
think so I think it's one of those things where it's a little bit suggestive, but we really need more research to kind of understand
Mm-hmm.
that. I think finding in particular with maybe a larger sample to really try to understand that. So that I would say is unclear. So I'm really excited and interested to see what happens next once we,
Yeah.
look at the other sample and see,
Yeah.
how it compares to people with full Down syndrome.
We'll definitely have to have you on the podcast when that one comes out because I think mental health in general, right, in this country as a whole is not uh, necessarily taken as seriously as it needs to be. And then you have mental health in people with disabilities, mental health in people with Down syndrome, and suddenly it's less and less and less paid attention to. And so I think a study like this, where it's saying there's this particular group of people who may be differently affected developmentally by Down syndrome, and how does that impact? It's to me, it was fascinating to see how just theorizing about how, here they are in a place where they don't necessarily fit in on either side. And I can't imagine being in that situation and saying, and not feeling some level of anxiety, depression. So it almost speaks to the importance for us societally to remember that every person needs to have a home where they can feel comfortable. Do you know what I mean?
Oh yeah.
A friendship home where they can feel comfortable. So yeah, really, really powerful stuff. Um, what we do have clinicians who listen to this podcast. Of course, we also have parents and caregivers and people with Down syndrome who listen to the podcast as well. What would you say you learned about what clinicians should do regarding mental health in somebody with mosaic Down syndrome. What should they be taking home from that paper?
Yeah. I think the biggest thing is making sure that they are um being screened, and
Yeah.
and that's a recommendation now, that everybody,
Mm.
children and adults, should be routinely screened in primary care. So hopefully that's happening.
Hmm.
I think um it's important that we are making sure to include self-report. So most of the participants with mosaic Down syndrome, have well-developed verbal skills and are, are able to kind of, complete a self-report. So they probably could complete this kind of standardized assessments that, other patients complete.
Yeah.
But I think we need to make sure that we're asking them, because parents don't always, kind of understand, especially depression and anxiety symptoms. We call them like internalizing symptoms within psychology, because they're internal, they're harder to observe. And if a person's not sharing, not talking about it, then, parents and other caregivers may not be aware.
Yeah.
And so I think that's one of the, I think, kind of big take home messages that I
Yeah.
always like to convey, is that we need to, make sure that we're asking them, how they're feeling, and that we're screening for anxiety and depression, and then making sure they're getting referral to mental health treatments, to counselors and therapists, and, and other mental health providers as needed, to be able to kind of help develop coping skills, and,
Yeah.
and treat that.
I love that. I think before we close this podcast today, I just wanted to make sure if there was anything else that you wanted to make sure that you leave with our audience. Like I'm gonna make sure that I include the IMDSA website. Of course, I'll put a link to the paper that at least the abstract they'll be able to read through if for anyone with the link, and then anything else that you would want to make sure that we include as we close this podcast.
Um, any other like
Any
big
other
like
any other resources or really
Mhm.
any like parting thoughts you want to make sure you leave with us?
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, I think, I would always say, of course, if you have concerns about your own or your loved one's mental health,
Yeah.
to, kind of reach out to your doctor or mental health
Yeah.
provider. And yeah, and then also I think, just to reiterating the sense of community, like that's been, I think particularly, for, a population that's maybe kind of in between, as we talked about, is really important. But just for everybody too, and I just, that's been on my mind a lot more. The U.S. Surgeon General that, is
Hmm.
just leaving. He just had his parting prescription for America,
Yeah.
and I think that he talks a lot about community in that, and the
Hmm.
like, the kind of loneliness epidemic, and I think that just applies to people with Down syndrome and mosaic Down
Yeah.
syndrome, just as much, if not more.
Yeah.
And so seeking out community is, and getting involved and having meaningful relationships is just so important.
Yes, without a doubt. And I think, I can speak for myself. I think this paper is definitely going to make me be much more cognizant, really specifically, even more so than ever before for my patients with mosaic Down syndrome, to make sure that I just take that time, perhaps even with their caregiver outside of the room, to be able to ask them these questions. Are you feeling these types of symptoms? And it's okay if you are. And I've definitely found that even before your paper came out, just anecdotally, that it did seem like my patients with mosaic Down syndrome, especially as they got into the double digit age ranges, were much more open about what they were feeling. And a lot of what you described in the paper is what they were feeling. So it was really validating to see that. And I hope that other listeners to this podcast who are clinicians will take this data seriously as well.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
And I think, I think one of the things too um, that's been so, interesting, that I've gotten a lot out of, kind of working with the IMDSA and people with mosaic Down syndrome, I think, is that, like, that verbal ability, and being able to kind of share, I think, a window into the experience of people with Down syndrome. And so I think we have to be careful too, that we're not assuming that because a person with Down syndrome who maybe doesn't have those verbal capacities to communicate doesn't have the same
Sure.
internal experience too,
Hmm.
that it may be that they are experiencing a lot of those, same kind of symptoms, but may have a harder time kind of communicating those. And so that puts, um, a lot of kind of onus on us as clinicians too, to be able to,
Yeah.
to try to find out a way to help them to communicate those experiences, if that's what, if they're having them.
Yeah. Yeah,
And that's,
perfect.
yeah.
Well, thank you so much, Ruth, for coming on the podcast with us again, and being able to share your knowledge with us. And we will definitely have you on again in the future to talk about whatever else comes out of this funded studies that you're going to hopefully be sending out way more information to us all. So thank you so much for joining us again.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you so much for having me. And it was really a pleasure.
Yes, and for our listeners, I do want to make sure that you know at any point if you have any questions or any speakers that you would like us to have onto the podcast to talk about any topic related to Down syndrome, please do email us at downsyndromecenter@chp.edu. And if you would like to join us in the work that we do here at the center, including this podcast, you can go to give2childrens.org/Down Syndrome Center. But until next time, bye-bye.